Virus, computer worms, malware. We all know these threats exist on the internet, but this new version changes how cyber threats operate. Because researchers have now tested an AI-powered worm that does not just spread through a network. It studies each machine it reaches, finds the weakness that fits, and adjusts its attack as it moves.
You get a worm in the mail, you don't know it's a worm, you think it's a PDF file, it's a picture, it's a click here on this link, whatever, you click on it, and boom, the worm is in your computer.
That means malware may no longer need every step planned in advance. Once it gets inside, it can start figuring out the path on its own. A worm is dangerous because it does not wait for every victim to make a mistake. A virus usually needs a carrier, a file, a program, something a person opens. A worm can move on its own after the first infection. Once it gets inside a network, it searches for other machines it can reach, finds a way in, and copies itself there. Then, the new machine becomes another starting point. The Morris worm made this visible in 1988, when one self-copying program spread across the early internet and slowed thousands of machines within a day. It did not need to delete files to cause disruption. Speed was enough. But even Morris had a limit. It could only follow the instructions its creator had already written. In 1988, the internet was still a small, trusted network of universities, research labs, and government-linked machines. That trust helped the system function, but it also gave the worm room to move. Robert Morris, a Cornell graduate student, had written the program to spread quietly across connected computers. He later said it was not meant to cause serious damage, but its replication logic went wrong. The worm copied itself more aggressively than intended, overloading machines as it moved. Within a day, thousands of computers were affected. Some institutions disconnected from the network just to stop reinfection. Email slowed. Researchers and administrators were trying to understand the attack while the network itself was struggling to carry their warnings. That was the real lesson of Morris. A worm did not need to steal data or erase files to become dangerous. It only needed to spread faster than people could respond. And compared to what researchers tested in Toronto, Morris was still predictable. For decades after Morris, defenders had a basic playbook. Find the weakness a worm used, patch it, and block the pattern. Traditional worms usually depend on fixed exploit logic. Someone writes code for a known weakness in a specific system, then the worm searches for machines where that same weakness still exists. WannaCry showed how powerful that could still be. In 2017, it spread across hundreds of thousands of machines in more than 150 countries by exploiting a known Windows file-sharing vulnerability. Microsoft had already released a patch, but many systems were still exposed. The damage came from the gap between knowing the fix and actually applying it. That predictability gave defenders something to chase. A traditional worm could move quickly, but it usually followed a path security teams could identify, model, and eventually cut off. The Toronto research attacks that old assumption at the root. On June 2, 2026, researchers from the University of Toronto, the Vector Institute, the University of Cambridge, and ServiceNow published a preprint titled AI Agent-Enabled Adaptive Computer Worms. They built a simulated company network called Fake Corp, with 33 machines across Linux, Windows, and IoT-like devices. Each machine had at least one real-world style weakness. The worm began on one compromised machine, scanned nearby systems, chose a target, attempted to gain elevated access, and then copied itself forward. The researchers ran 15 trials, each lasting up to 7 days. On average, the worm identified 31.3 vulnerabilities, gained elevated access on 23.1 hosts, and replicated to 20.4 machines. In some runs, it reached 7 generations of self-replication. Those numbers matter, but the method matters more. Each machine became a new problem to solve, rather than another place to repeat the same attack. The worm used an open-weight language model running locally, so its reasoning did not depend on a company's API staying online. At each stage, its agent system generated attack strategies in real time. It inspected the target's configuration, services, and exposed software, then built an approach around what that specific machine revealed. When an attempt failed, it could troubleshoot. It could analyze the error, adjust the method, and try again. In some cases, it even modified its own code to better fit the environment it had entered. The most important detail was what it could do with information it had never seen during training. The worm could read fresh vulnerability advisories at runtime. If a weakness had been publicly disclosed after the model was trained, the system could still find the advisory, interpret it, and use it while moving through the network. Old malware arrives with a fixed instructions sheet. This version can read the manual on the table and choose the tool that fits the machine in front of it. The worm was not conscious. It was an agent system pursuing a narrow objective: gain access, replicate, and keep moving. The unsettling part is that a human no longer had to predict every target in advance. Once malware can read the machine in front of it, patching becomes a race against adaptation.
When these capabilities are embedded in a self-replicating agent, they produce a fundamentally new cybersecurity threat.
The Toronto worm did not depend on a commercial AI service or a provider-controlled server. It ran a locally deployed open-weight model on hardware it had already compromised. That changes containment. When an AI system depends on a company's servers, the provider can apply filters, rate limits, monitoring, account bans, and refusals. Those controls matter when the model is behind a gate. They lose power when the model is already running inside the network. The danger grows when infected machines become part of the worm's infrastructure. In the experiment, stronger compromised machines can provide reasoning support for weaker devices. A low-power machine did not need to run the model itself if it could route requests through a more capable infected host. So the worm is not only spreading across the network, it is turning parts of the network into the machinery that helps it continue. Centralized safeguards become less relevant when the attacker has moved the workshop inside the building. That does not erase defense. Network segmentation, endpoint detection, patching, monitoring, and access controls still matter, but the threat model changes. A victim machine is no longer only something the worm infects. It can become the machine that helps the worm think. The Toronto experiment had limits that matter. The test network was built to be vulnerable. There was no antivirus, no endpoint detection, no active firewall, and every one of the 33 machines had at least one exploitable weakness. So this does not prove that the same worm could tear through a hardened computer network tomorrow, but it does prove something important. The architecture works. Adaptive targeting, runtime strategy generation, multi-generation replication, and self-modification were all demonstrated under controlled conditions. The prototype was imperfect, but the pattern is now real. For defenders, the timeline gets tighter. Traditional worm defense depends on breaking a known attack chain. Patch the weakness, block the signature, cut off the route. But adaptive malware can read public advisories, adjust to different systems, and exploit the messy parts of real networks that are harder to patch. Weak passwords, open services, reused credentials, forgotten devices, sloppy configurations. These are not always fixed by one software update. They are the loose wires inside every large network. The danger is not that this exact prototype escapes tomorrow. The danger is that cyber attacks now have a demonstrated blueprint for being more autonomous, more flexible, and less dependent on human direction after launch. For most of internet history, humans made the important choices before an attack began. What to target, what exploit to use, how the campaign should move. The automation came later, during execution. The Toronto experiment points to a different structure. A worm that can inspect a machine, reason about it, consult updated information, adjust its method, and copy itself forward does not need a human steering every step. The decisions are inside the system. That matters because the internet runs on quiet trust. Laptops talk to servers. Printers sit inside office networks. Cameras connect to management systems. Hospitals and emergency grids depend on software most people never see. Every connection that makes the system useful can also become a path. An adaptive worm turns that trust into terrain. Every weak device becomes a stepping stone. Every misconfigured system becomes a door it can learn to open, even if that door was never on its original map. The Morris worm showed that self-replication alone could shake the early internet. The Toronto experiment suggests the next stage is self-replication with reasoning. The future threat may not be the worm that spreads the fastest. It may be the one that keeps learning the shape of the network as it moves through it, long after the human who launched it has stepped away.